All right, guys, welcome to the Academy. Today I have the absolute pleasure of speaking once again with Rafe Kelley. So Rafe, thank you for joining us very much today. Why don't you just give us a really brief introduction about who you are and what you do?
Well, thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm the founder of Evolve Move Play, which is a movement method based on the idea that the human being evolved for movement. We didn't evolve for sedentary lifestyles, and there's an enormous range of kind of negative impacts on our psychological, emotional, and physical health through sedentary lifestyle. We evolved to learn movement primarily through play, and play encodes the most important movements, the most nutritious movements that human beings need, because evolution basically built us to have a drive to engage in those type of activities. So if you look at the types of play that are common across all cultures, that's the kind of most important movements that we should do. So my method's based on that. And I have a background of 13 years, 14 years of doing parkour, almost 30 years of doing martial arts, various gymnastics, capoeira, dance, etc., that have kind of blended in to create what I do. That's a good start right there.
Fantastic. And what was it that initially attracted you to parkour? What was it about parkour that you were drawn to?
It's interesting. I would say, if we go back a little bit, when I was 8 years old, I had severe learning disabilities, and I was being asked to kind of hold me back in school. And my mom chose to homeschool me at that time, and I had a mentor who came into my life and took over my education, and he ended up reading me The Lord of the Rings. And that story was so inspirational to me that it gave me the motivation to teach myself to read. And so I read The Lord of the Rings, and then I read the Illiad and the Odyssey. And I got really into epic literature. And I remember kind of really aspiring to be like the characters in those books. And then at like 12 years old, I kind of felt like I made the realization that there weren't any orcs, there weren't any dragons out there to slay in the world that I saw. And I was very disenchanted, and I actually became pretty physically inactive between, say, 12 and 15. And I got really big really fast. I'm 6'1" or 1.86 meters for the metric folks. And I was that tall by the time I was 14 and a half. So I was kind of awkward and gawky, geeky kid. And the first thing that really struck me was actually gymnastics. The 1996 Olympics, I saw Carrie Strug. The American women's team won the gold medal. It was the first time we won the gold medal in ages. And the American women's team was led by, one of the athletes was Carrie Strug. She was not one of the best athletes. A bunch of the other athletes, who are some of the top athletes that we'd ever produced, failed on vault. And we had this insurmountable lead against the Russians. But nobody else was able to hit their vault. And so Carrie Strug, it kind of all came down to her. If she could hit one of her two vaults, she would secure the gold, right? She only needed to hit one out of two, but she had to hit it, or else we were going to lose this gold that we had this huge lead on. So she went down the runway, she did the first vault, and she landed and she broke her ankle. She landed poorly. So then, the whole effort of the U.S. gymnastics team for years was depending on this one vault that she had to run down and do with a broken leg. And she did, and she landed it. And she turns around, she hops on one leg, and she salutes the judges, and you could see the pain in her face. Super heroic moment, right? And that struck me, and so I got really interested in gymnastics. And I couldn't have articulated it at the time, but I think that I saw something heroic in the kind of physical effort that it took to train yourself to do these things. And that was very attractive to me. So when I saw parkour, it became much more obvious. For me, parkour was this: someone had taken gymnastics and ripped the lid off of it and revealed the primal underpinnings. It's the same basic types of movements in a way, but parkour was the expression that was much closer to the stuff that we evolved for. And so when I saw David Bell jumping from building to building, I was just hooked. It was immediate. And right away, it was like this sense that there may not be dragons out there to slay, but there's dragons inside you. And if you can take on a practice that allows you to confront your fears and to become a stronger person and to do things that are beautiful and heroic in the world, that's something really valuable. And so that's why I got into parkour.
That's something I find particularly interesting about parkour specifically is the fear element. You hear people mention that a lot, and obviously the stuff that you guys do, there's a high risk and danger element, obviously, especially if you were untrained in to do that sort of thing. So was that, you know, the fear thing and the danger element, is that a part of it still that drives you in terms of trying to do more dangerous things and higher risk things? Is that something that's part of it still?
So there's a big distinction that I make between risk and danger. And it's really important to understand the practice that we engage in. Because if you don't understand that distinction, it just looks like we're adrenaline junkies trying to, get close to death. And that's not really it at all. But basically, risk to me is the likelihood that something's going to fail. Mm-hmm. Danger is the consequences if it fails. So when you're looking at a jump, if it's low danger, it can be high risk, right? I'll do jumps, all day that are next to the ground that I'm going to fall off of repeatedly. But when I do something that's high, I have to have very low risk, right? My rule for myself is when I look at a jump that there's serious consequences. If I fail, I have to feel like I could do it 1,000 times out of 1,000. Right? I'm not going to fail. Mm-hmm. And that's actually, I think, what's brilliant about it, right? People say, oh, risk, danger, but we need risk. We need danger in life, because everything that we really want to do is a bit scary, is a bit risky, right? Whether it's asking for promotion, whether it's starting a new business, whether it's asking out a girl or a boy who you like all that stuff is about dealing with fear. Mm-hmm. If you don't have a practice that allows you to kind of look at that, you're not as powerful as you could be in taking on life. And so I think that one of the most powerful benefits of parkour as a practice, or practices that engage in the same type of kind of risk management and dealing with the edge of fear, is that they teach you in a very real, very honest way about your own fear and how you develop a relationship with it.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's something that you see even on a reduced scale if you work with people, in the sense that I have over the years, in terms of trying to teach the general sort of personal training kind of community, the elements of gymnastics, being on the rings, going upside down, handstand work, just little things like that. And you can see, even with a cartwheel, there's elements of fear, because initially you're throwing your head towards the ground. You have no map for it. You don't exactly know what's going to happen. And even in those little tiny jumps, you see people, the little leaps that people make when they start to overcome those little things, you can see that there's so much more going on than just an exercise or learning a movement or whatever, So I think that's a really cool distinction to make. The other thing I find interesting about it, I've gotten heavily into meditative practice. It's something I do a lot of the time now. And I was recently in Bali, and somehow in Bali, even though I was with my family, there's a lot of relaxation time, which was amazing. And at one point I was meditating like 3 times a day, various different things I was doing, kind of playing around with my mind, if you like. And one thing I noticed is that when you spend that amount of time in this kind of alpha theta kind of state, you just, all the kind of like little anxieties and fears that you would have carried around with you just dissipate. They're not relevant anymore. Mm-hmm. And one of the interesting things I think about movement is very alpha. You tend to be, especially if you're allowed to be very alpha with movement, right? So there's this whole connection there with just movement itself generating this kind of alpha state, alpha being a state where you don't have the anxieties and the fear that you might normally do in your life. Is this kind of what you're talking about when you say, like how you see that movement practice can be leveraged to support general life goals? Is that kind of the whole thing what you're getting at?
That's part of it, yeah. So when you do something really kind of that's on the edge of what you're capable of physically, and you succeed at it, it tends to turn, one of the things we said for many years in the beginning of the parkour community is you feel like it turns the volume down on the stresses in the rest of your life. Right? It's like you have this knowledge that you're the type of thing that overcomes challenges. And so as little challenges come up in your life, you have these episodes, these memories of having accomplished something really intense, and you can pull on that. A few years ago at one of my seminars, I had a young woman who who I, who's, you know, she's a physically fit person. She's a trainer, but she deals with a lot of, she has a lot of anxiety and fear. And so I was coming, she was up ahead of me. I was checking with the rest of the group, and I came down and she was looking at this jump, and it was a jump that was definitely within her capability. It was maybe 7 feet across with a little bit of a drop but it was over a waterfall. So it was scary. It was a very scary situation. And so I came up, and another one of our students was encouraging her to try and do the jump. And so I went there and I stood with her on the edge of on the other side, right next to the wall, the waterfall. And I was like, you know, you don't have to do the jump, but we know that you can do the jump. We believe in you, and we'll support you in any way. It'll be very safe if you try this jump. And she said, is it okay if I do it while I'm crying? Or is it okay if I cry while I do it? And I said, sure, you know, and she jumped over, and sure enough, she was crying the whole time. And when she got done, she was crying, but she was also laughing, and she was like really happy. And so I talked to her about, that's okay, that's your process. And kind of celebrated that with her. And then, you know, she sent me an email a few months later saying, like, every time that she encounters something really scary and hard and she has to confront something, she can kind of go back to that. She can pull strength off of that memory. And so I think there's this really interesting thing about training yourself to be the type of person who overcomes challenges, who sees something, knows that they can do it, then goes into it and doesn't go away from it. It's like basically the more that it's almost like I think of parkour in a sense as cognitive behavioral therapy made physical. Mm-hmm. Cognitive behavioral therapy. Mm-hmm. Okay, so essentially, like when you make the choice to confront things, it builds that part of you. It's like neurologically, you're building the heroic part of yourself, and you're actually walking away from the parts of yourself that are easily driven by fear. And you're also learning to map out the world. You're learning to sort of say, this is the stuff that I can control, and this is the stuff that I can't control, and here's the level of challenge that I can deal with, and here's the level of challenge that I can't deal with yet, right? And so you learn to not kind of push yourself against the unachievable. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of like, you can think of that from a psychological perspective, like the story that you carry in your brain. You can also think about that from a neurological perspective, like you're literally all of the wiring that's associated with the types of actions that lead you to overcoming something. All those are being reinforced. And then you can think about it on like the brainwave level, right? Yeah, when you're in flow, fear has a very difficult time entering. But that kind of the flow research is something that I'm just digging into right now. So I don't know as much about the brainwave research. So I can't really speak to how much that's predominant, but I suspect, based on what I know, that within the practice of parkour, there's quite a variation. It's not like going down a mountain skiing, for instance, where once you're into the run, you're kind of in flow the entire time. You pop in and out of it more, I think, in the parkour practice because you have to stop and think about things, and because your body gets tired, you know, when you do really explosive stuff without the aid of a slope, without the aid of skis. There's a moment where you have to kind of like bring yourself back. And so it's more episodic. It's more, which I think is actually more useful in some ways, because you have to reclaim the state repeatedly. So every time that you have to kind of like pop out, then as you prepare for the next thing, breathing, centering your mind, going into it, it's training you to be better at reattaining that state.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a very interesting just topic in general, man. And it's something that one of the things that I've been discussing recently, we did this in our Thailand retreat, was talking about the ultimate, like the real baseline point of a brain and nervous system. And ultimately, one thing I've said in that is it sounds kind of esoteric and strange, but it's ultimately to transduce space-time and everything that your perceptions are based on therein. So there's an element of the fact that obviously our realities are something that we do tend to create within our mind. It's not so much a recreation of the external world. There is a literal creation via the visual system and via all of the senses. So built into that is your beliefs, your perceptions, your fears, your anxieties, all those things. And it's a case of what you're describing, I think, is a really good point in that, in terms of movement practice and overcoming things within the environment, or, you know, things within space-time that we perceive via your movement capacity, is a hugely powerful process to go through, right? And it's something that innately human beings have had to do since beginning of time, let's say. So let's get into a little bit of the actual ways that you look at coaching and movement in general. I know you have a real deep interest in movement learning and learning in general. And one of the things I always enjoy hearing you speak about is the task and environment constraint-based learning. And I've got little things in it that I've noticed over the years, but tell us a bit about what that means and what, why it's so important to you.
Yeah, so task constrained learning is, just to kind of give an overview of it, is basically the idea that the motor learning system can self-organize based on what's asked of it, right? So if you reach out and grab something, right, that's a task, and it constrains the way that you can operate into certain ways. And the more constraints there are in the environment, the narrower your set of options are. So for instance, if you're standing, right, and you need to reach and grab something, you have more options than if you're on all fours. So the basic idea here is that if you want to shape the way that someone moves, if you can produce constraints within the environment or within the parameters of the task that help them organize better, that produces a more stable outcome than if you try to produce the same kind of effect in their skill development by giving them verbal cues. Because essentially we didn't really evolve to learn movement through verbal cueing. There's a difference between procedural memory, which is memory that's related to acting something out, like brushing your teeth, and semantic memory, which is how you describe something. So we all know somebody who can talk a great game about all the ins and outs of some physical activity, but can't do it themselves at all. Right? The armchair quarterback, I guess, well, that's an American analogy, but armchair halfback. Someone can watch a soccer game and talk with extraordinary, or football game, start with extraordinary sort of articulateness about all the things that the players are doing wrong. But if you ask them to actually go on the field, they'd be hopeless. So these two things, we think that they're more connected. We tend to act as teachers as if they're more connected than they are. Right? The ability to talk about something, the ability to describe it coherently, and the ability to act it out. So it turns out that, you know, the more that your movement control system is reliant on your prefrontal cortex, on your verbal processing centers, the slower it is and the less robust the movement patterns are. It doesn't mean that you never want to talk to your students and help them understand things through verbal stuff. That's a powerful skill. But what it means is that it's actually very easy to interrupt someone's motor learning through excessive cueing or cueing that's inappropriate to the task. And that if you can get the same result in teaching by having somebody do a task with constraints, as opposed to trying to impose the constraints really verbally, you're going to get a better result in the long run. So a classic example from gymnastics you kind of may recognize is when someone's learning a cartwheel and they're struggling to get the cartwheel straight overhead. You can tell them over and over again, you can give them, okay, kick your back leg up stronger, don't let it come around here. And it can be very, very difficult for them to understand you. But if you put two wedge mats standing upright and you have them cartwheel between it, the only way for them to succeed and not hit the wedge mats is to get their legs in the correct plane. And that actually turns out to be a far more effective teaching tool a lot of the time. Classic example that I give is, you know, within the kind of movement sphere, there's a huge emphasis on quadrupedal movement, moving on all fours. And the base pattern for quadrupedal movement is the bear walk, or, you know, the basic, you know, being on all fours with your knees off the ground and doing a basic crawling pattern. If you ask a student of a class of novice students to do this, you'll find that approximately 50% of them will will struggle to have a contralateral pattern, or they will adopt a ipsilateral pattern. So contralateral means that as one hand moves forward, the opposite foot moves forward. This is the same pattern that you use when walking, right? As one arm swings forward, the opposite foot is moving forward. For some reason, a lot of people have trouble organizing that pattern when you put them on flat ground. So they'll end up going, so when one hand moves forward, the same side foot is going to move forward. If you try to cue them by using a word like contralateral movement, it's not going to translate at all because they don't have that vocabulary. It's not meaningful for them. It doesn't draw an image. It doesn't connect well into the motor learning centers. So that's, you know, you're smart and you understand things as a teacher, but you're not doing anything that's actually useful to the student. And then you could say something like opposite hand, opposite foot, and that's a little bit more precise, or it's a little bit easier for them to understand, but it's still really weird language actually for them to absorb. It's hard. We don't have good language to help them understand that. You can physically cue them. You can do a kinesthetic cue, and that's a little bit more helpful. But what turns out to work really well is just putting them in an environment where there's a stability demand as they're doing quadrupedal movement, because contralateral is just way more stable than ipsilateral. So when we ask people to start doing movement in trees and just have them move on all fours, they automatically adopt a contralateral pattern. So once you kind of make this basic realization about task constraints, you could ask, what are the task constraints that are most important for human movement that will help us shape movement to be better controlled in general? And actually, before I go into that, just let me go back for a second. So the motor learning system basically wants solutions that are stable across lots of different problem sets. Right? That's what it's interested in. So what happens is, as you're learning movement tasks, the motor learning system is sort of saying, here's what helps me control this task. And then then the next time you train something that's a little bit different, it says, okay, well, these things were stable across those two task sets. So those are what we're going to emphasize. So then you build up a kind of a vocabulary of the most important task constraints. So you can imagine that if there's, say, 10 things in this column and 10 things in this column, the things that are true across all those columns are the most important. This is why we see that multi-sport athletes tend to have higher ceilings than athletes who specialize earlier, because they basically build a better framework for overall movement control, which is more adaptable as they advance to elite levels. So in the same sense, what I believe is true is that movement in nature inherently gives a better set of task constraints that teaches us more about the control factors that the human motor system is best kind of will allow the human motor system to best control itself across the wider set of task constraints. That's essentially why I think natural movement, or one of the many reasons why natural movement or movement in nature is a better base or foundation for physical capacity. Does all that kind of
100%.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of the principles of task constrained learning and why they're related to natural movement. And this was a discovery that I made by taking, having come from gymnastics teaching in a gym, moved into teaching parkour in a gym, and then started taking my parkour teaching into nature. And what I found was that basically movement in nature allowed my students to figure out the fundamentals of skills much faster, and skills that would be difficult for me to teach in the gym often occurred just naturally in students' exploration when they were outside. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so that was a very big discovery, and it was actually one of my students who then cued me into motor learning theory and dynamic systems theory and kind of all of these things that now have given me a backing for some of the strategies that I was already taking on intuitively through having watched what happens when you take something like a parkour practice and you place it in nature instead of in the gym. Something completely different happens. Mm.
It's something I saw. I mean, we spoke about this a long time ago now, at the start of this year. And again, in our Thailand trip, we took people out and we did this. There was this beautiful mountain backdrop in Chiang Mai, and there was a hike you could do with this guy who was like 65 years old. He looked like 23. and he was the fittest guy, you know. He did this hike every single day, and it was a couple hours up and a couple hours down. And the ground was quite unforgiving. It's very kind of uneven and slippy. And there's a couple of people in the group who might have said they had really, you know, really tight calves and they couldn't do X, Y, or Z. But then I was just kind of watching them just, you know, deal with this sort of environment and deal with it perfectly. I mean, deal with it in the sense that you don't look like you have tight calves now and your hips are moving really well. And, you know, the system is coordinating itself in such a way that it's dealing with the problem at hand, because that's what a nervous system does. Right. That's what it does. That's the ultimate point, is that it will ultimately adapt, because for several reasons. One, it wants to be energy efficient. And ultimately it doesn't want to have to constantly be spending energy to learn.
Yeah.
So therein lies a process where it's going to become efficient at some point. Therefore it's going to ultimately solve the task. And as you say, with nature, there's some very special things that happen when we are outside. So there's another couple of things that I've always found really interesting in movement, and how people, how ultimately it improves people's capacity to learn movement. And one of them, the two main things, one is imagery, and the other is rhythm. And I find imagery particularly interesting. There's a lot of, I mean, the neurophysiology of it is essentially that when you visualize a motor task, or you go through a guided motor imagery, if it's specifically related to learning a movement, that the system is firing the muscles in the same way as if you were performing the movement. But the key difference is that it's not getting any feedback on errors, noxious stimulus, stuff not working, that kind of thing. So there's a sensory component that isn't there when you visualize a motor pattern. And that can be useful for pain. It can be useful for, like, if somebody has pain in a particular movement, you can have them sit and create an affect in which they visualize the movement, and then the pain isn't relevant, and it can actually positively influence that situation. So imagery is one, rhythm is the other, either being an internally generated rhythm or moving to an external rhythm. Of course, we're talking about music, or if you want to take it in a really isolated way, like a metronome or some kind of beat, some kind of frequency, right? Do those elements play a role in your coaching and your movement work?
Yeah, absolutely. So as far as how you cue somebody, the use of imagery is really key. Because as you just described, it essentially communicates with the motor system much more effectively than the use of kind of specific verbal language. So for instance, a cue that I like to give people when it comes to landing a jump. So a classic kind of thing you would say for someone landing a jump is that they're supposed to land on the ball of their foot or land on their toes, right? Or when they're landing a precision jump, you also want the foot to be dorsiflexed. So this is kind of counterintuitive for a lot of people, because when you're landing straight down, you want to plantar flex your foot. You want to point your foot down so your foot can absorb the landing. But when you're landing a precision jump, if your foot is pointed down, you've removed most of the surface area that's gonna stop the jump, right? So you've taken the brakes off. So you're gonna tend to slide on your foot. So you actually have to have your heel below the height of the thing that you're jumping onto when you jump onto an edge. So again, if you use the type of language like dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, people don't have an image in their brain. That's a slow process for them to access. So what I cue people to do is to think about grabbing with their foot, to imagine that they're actually reaching and grabbing and pulling themselves onto the object with their foot. And this turns into a much more effective thing. And then like my imagery in my head, when I do that is, I think it was in Planet Earth, David Attenborough. There's an image of some lemurs jumping through trees. And there's this slow motion footage of them reaching out and grabbing branches with their feet as they land. And they're these incredible animals that jump from tree to tree, sort of like what would be called a cat to cat in parkour terminology. But they can do that to tree branches that actually have thorns on them, and thread the toes through the thorns and land on these branches. It's absolutely incredible, the level of motor control that these animals have. So anyways, that's my personal image that I use. Nick Winkelman, who's one of my big influences in cueing, he says that there are three keys to an effective cue: direction, distance, and description. So direction is, where are you applying force to the external world? In what direction, right? Distance is, where is your focus? right? Is your focus close to your body or far away from your body? And then description is, as you said, it's essentially using analogies to help someone visualize the skill. So the classic one he did his research on, and he did a I think it's like maybe a master's thesis, PhD thesis, I can't remember, on the use of how to cue someone during the acceleration phase of sprinting. And the cue he used was come up like a jet plane, not like a helicopter. So the classic thing when you're sprinting is the tendency to get upright too early and not to apply force to the ground and get good horizontal force production. So that cue produces a very strong image in the brain that's very easy for most athletes to process. He found that using that cue over more of a traditional cue, like, keep your shins at 45, right? Keep a 45-degree angle on your shin and drive your knees up. He was able to improve people's 20-meter times, I believe it was 20 meters by 0.2 seconds. And this is in trained sprinters, and trained, not elite sprinters, but like trained team sport athletes. That's absolutely astounding, right? It was over the course of 6 weeks, I believe. So the use of cues that use imagery, incredibly important. As far as rhythm, man, rhythm is a very big interest of mine right now. It's something that I'm still just starting to articulate and figure out the role of rhythm in movement. I had a self-perception of someone who's profoundly unrhythmic and like really bad with music and couldn't play percussion or anything like that for years. I'll often like get off beat when clapping with groups of people. I was really self-conscious about it actually. But what I've recognized is that the ability to control rhythm in a movement sequence is one of the most fundamental abilities. So if you think about what flow is in a parkour context, like the first thing is essentially being able to stay within rhythm. And you can think of gait, right, running as a specific rhythm, right? And then as a tempo based on how fast you're going, right? So there's a set of beats and there's a given sort of, if we know one beat is so long, then we know the next beat is so long, right? As a given rhythm. And then there's a speed that those beats can be at, right? And that's based on how you're accelerating or decelerating. Then if you're getting into complex motor patterns like Kong vaults and laches and underbars, all of a sudden you're dealing with using the rhythm basically in a different way. The beats are placed differently, and then it's differently organized through the body. So the ability to translate effectively between these rhythmic sections is one of these huge elements of flow. And then if we look at something like doing a juggling task, what allows you to juggle well with somebody else is basically being able to fall into the same rhythm. We look at something like fighting. Essentially, there's an inherent tendency to fall into rhythm. The athlete that tends to dominate in a fighting situation is the athlete who can recognize the tendency to fall into rhythm, the tendency to fall into pattern, and to break the rhythm or break the pattern, and to kind of force the opponent to be where they know they will be. So we've done a lot of work now with incorporating music into kind of parkour and playing with how do we kind of feel a rhythm in a music and then start applying movement patterns with that rhythm. There's one of different ways that we're working on developing the rhythmic capacity. But what's really interesting about this and what taps into what you were talking about in the beginning there is that it seems to unlock really amazing flow states. And people will do things that are very unexpected to them once they tap into that sense of rhythm. And the rhythm gives them a sense of flow. And, my best story about this was I was playing, we were doing some sort of open capoeira influenced dancing to music once. And I did a kick the moon, which is a flip off one leg, a backwards flip off one leg. And I hadn't done it in like 3 years. And it just occurred in the moment. It was just natural for me to be able to do it. So that's the type of thing that's unlocked when the relationship with the rhythm is developed effectively in kind of the athlete.
Yeah, it is a fascinating thing to observe, and it's the depth of what's going on in the brain and the nervous system, and even at a cellular level in the body when you include sound.
Mm-hmm.
It is really interesting to me. There's a statement that geometry is sound embedded, and essentially it's hard to kind of explain what that means. But basically, there's something called somatics as well. Somatics is where you have a diaphragm, like a drum type of thing, and on top of that you'll have sand or some kind of powder or even water, and then there's frequencies played with under the diaphragm, different sound frequencies, and what instantaneously happens depending on the frequency is that the sand or the water on top takes on a geometrical pattern, a specific geometry based on the frequency. And that's going on in the body all the time, like on a very subtle level, whether it be from the attuned rhythm of the brain in terms of the actual frequency, because the brain's literally oscillating differently in a flow state than it is if someone's stressed and anxious and worrying about something, and you know, and that, you know, we're made with bags of water, so that's proliferating and creating literal geometrical form throughout the entire system. And I've always found it really interesting how when you just, even I've always been in a gym setting, right? This is just where I've always been. But if you get someone who, like you've described, doing crawling patterns, and it's okay, maybe the room's doing a fairly good job at it, but then you just bring in the fact that I want you to let your body entrain to the rhythm, whether it be metronome, whether it be music, everything changes, and it changes instantly. And I've always found that just an amazing thing to watch, and it's an amazing thing for people to experience and feel. And that's the other thing I wanted to go on to. It's been kind of like a nice segue there. It's just that we talk about the use of imagery and how important rhythm and frequency and sound is. When it comes to movement, especially complicated movement patterns, you have feel. There is a sense to it, right? And this is also why verbal cueing, I think we're in complete agreement on this, is just really ineffective because it doesn't generate any kind of experience. There's no feel, right? There's no sense to what's happening. And it's also, whenever I sucked at learning new complicated patterns. It took me a long time to be able to do even like a cartwheel, handstands, things like that. But there's a lot to be said for just throwing something and trying, and ultimately, once you feel it, something clicks, and again, something changes, doesn't it? Can you comment on that, or just on sensing and feeling within movement?
Yeah, I mean, your movement is an embodied experience, or movement control is an embodied experience. So again, we can talk about it as much as we like, but if you can't do it, if you can't act it out, then then it doesn't matter, and you're not going to be able to help people that much with it. So this actually kind of leads me in a slightly different direction, but one of the big things is going back to this idea of what is a brain for, right? A brain is to help you move towards things that you want and away from things that you don't want. And you're equipped essentially at the very, like, kind of the most basic neurological level with a drive to explore the environment and realize what it affords you, right? So everything out there is scary and potentially dangerous, but all the things that you need are out there too. And so you start to explore, right? And as long as you don't get hurt, as long as nothing aversive happens, you kind of expand your horizons. You expand and you find new resources. And as you find resources and you explore through your space and you repeat patterns that work, then you start playing with them and adding variation to it. And this is kind of how behavior tends to develop. So when you engage in any movement practice, essentially you're replicating this process. You're exploring a task space, right? And you're getting things that are good, and getting away from things that are bad, basically, or you're not, right? And if things are happening that are too aversive all the time, it's going to tend to shut you down, right? And if things are happening that are good, it's going to tend to open you up. So there's a couple things that are important there. One is, obviously it's about dosing something correctly when you're engaging in a movement practice. If you're trying things that are too hard all the time, you're going to get broken, and you're going to end up walking away from it. The other thing is, can you make yourself more tolerant of failure physically? Can you train in such a way that your body becomes more robust to the things that could go wrong? And then can you train your mind to be more robust to the things that could go wrong? And then can you find the wins even in spaces that seemingly are not successful, right? Those are, if you can kind of code in robustness on all of those levels, then you have an organism that's going to be very successful at the process of exploration and is going to expand themselves really effectively into any space that they want to. So the last idea is an idea from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who's kind of the big author of flow, who says, you know, essentially flow is where you're under high demands and you have a high competence, right? If you're under high demands and you don't have high competence, then you're struggling, right? If you have low competence and you're under high demand, then it's incredibly anxiety driving. But there's a huge difference between people's ability to look at a situation and see themselves as struggling or anxiety ridden or successful based on their ability to break things down into smaller wins, right? You can go in and say, do jujitsu, and you're wrestling with somebody. And let's say you get tapped out every time, you get tapped out multiple times every time you're wrestling. And you could just look at that as a straight loss every time. And very soon your motivation to train is going to disappear. But if you can find the small wins, like I held my guard a little bit longer, right? They had to go to a secondary technique. They didn't get me with the first technique today, right? They've been getting me with rear naked chokes. They're no longer getting me with rear naked chokes. If you can find all those little wins and you shift your mindset, you become more robust and you become more able to deal with what looks like failure from the outside because you've created internal success. And that makes you stronger to be able to go forward into the world. So I don't know, that's what was triggered in my head when we were talking about feel. That's how you get yourself into the space that allows you to develop the feeling for things. Because if every time you enter that space, it hurts, whether it's physical or emotional, it's going to drive you away from it. You're not going to be able to pay attention. You're not going to be able to experience things if your affect is too anxiety ridden. So preparing yourself properly to get into a space that's not anxiety ridden is absolutely key to being able to get the feel that's going to allow you to expand and become a more embodied human being.
It's a cool topic. It's interesting speaking with you because whenever we speak, there's always it always ties back into where we're at with our education with AMN at the moment, and I think we share a lot of commonalities. We have very different movement backgrounds and all that kind of stuff, but the general message is always very coherent. And so much of everything in one's life comes down to perception. It really it comes down to understanding, or trying to aim to have an understanding of just how the organism works and what's the underlying principles of how the organism works, and being able to not detach yourself from it per se, but just to be aware of how this thing functions, right? And I often describe the brain as this amazing it's a virtual reality machine. It's basically what it does. And sometimes you get really caught up in the special effects. You get caught up in the show that the brain's pulling out for you, the show that the brain's putting on. And that might be something that's making you feel like you're incapable in some way, or that there's fear or anxiety, wherever, as we've described a lot there. But it's just that you're getting caught up in the show. It's just a perception. And if you can be aware that there is the possibility of a little gap there, as you're describing, it creates a robustness, trying to find the wins instead of viewing everything as a loss. Everything comes down to perception, because the brain is literally on a moment-to-moment basis creating that on your behalf, but it's doing it kind of based on where you're directing it and what it's taking in at the same time. So I think it's just interesting for people to kind of see that sometimes. And when, I've spoken about meditation before, we've spoken about the role of movement, but in general, every moment to moment existence, if you can be aware of that, you kind of always, you're always just dropping down out of that kind of beta state, and you're always just being aware that you're always in the present moment, right? This is the thing. Like when you become aware of that, you're always very present, and you can kind of give yourself a break to, to be adaptable and to know sometimes that you do get caught up in fear, and that's just a human response, but that's not how you're going to carry on in the next moment and the next moment and the next moment. And I don't know, it's an interesting, it's hard to articulate, it's hard to describe, but I think movement is a great way to ultimately experience that.
Yeah. So I want to, if I could just jump on that and grab it for a second. You talked about the idea that the brain is like a virtual reality machine. Perhaps your audience is really familiar with this, but this is something that I'm learning more about recently. Particularly, I've been not directly. I need to go directly into it, but I've been running into the work of J.J. Gibson. You're familiar with J.J. Gibson and the ecological theory of vision?
Sure.
Yeah.
Not in depth, but I've heard the work. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, I think what you're describing, I think a lot of it comes from Gibson. I think Gibson was the first person to really recognize this. So when you look at if you kind of take a second to take a snapshot of your visual field right now, you think that you're seeing most of what's in that visual field. But what's actually happening is that your eye is darting around and filling in tons of pixels in your visual field, but a lot of them are actually blank in any given moment. If you were to actually take a momentary slice of what the eye is actually seeing, a lot of what's in your visual field is literally your imagination. Your brain is projecting what it remembers about that visual field. And then what you see in your visual field is your nervous system didn't evolve to tell you what existed objectively, except to the point where that it evolved to tell you what was relevant to your survival, what helped you get, again, the things that you want, things that are good, and avoid the things that are bad. You know, at the very root, it's like, it's aversive versus appetitive. Things that move us towards the things that we have appetites for, and things that move us towards the things that are damaging to us. And so the nervous system, or the sensory system, is essentially feeding you information based on the story or narrative that you're experiencing, and the motivational state that you're in. And it's imagining a lot of it. It's literally, like you said, it's a projection. A lot of it is projected. Now, we can go too far in the opposite direction, where we start thinking that, you know, reality doesn't exist outside of us, because reality can slap you in the face. And it's like, you know, you know, what is the secret? Like, you know, conceive it, right? Believe it.
Sure.
Receive
Yeah.
it. Conceive it, believe it, receive it, right? People will start kind of believing that, you know,
You don't have to do anything.
Anything that they want, right? It's
Yeah.
like, well, you can't conceive and perceive and believe yourself out of a heart attack. In the moment of a heart attack, that shit is happening, right? If I do a jump at height and I fall, no amount of engaging with the secret is going to change the fact that I have to deal with that.
You're going to hit the ground. Yeah. Yeah.
So reality's out there, but the way that we experience reality is intensely driven by what we perceive.
Yeah.
Whether I fall or not is actually a lot about how I set up my perception and the story that I have as I set up the jump. This is something, actually, this is a funny story. I was in Spain teaching this retreat recently, and I woke up in the middle of the night because I had this bizarre dream where a friend of mine who's in the parkour community was yelling at me that faith in self is the moral imperative that allows you to see the landing and not the fall when you jump. It's such a strange thing. It was such a weirdly declarative statement.
Hugely profound statement as well.
Yeah. Well, so I woke right up. And as I woke up, I remembered this old video that Daniel Labaki, is widely considered one of the greatest parkour athletes ever had produced. It was called Choose Not to Fall. And he said in the video, you know, if you're afraid to fall and you fall because you're afraid. So choose not to fall. And I thought this was kind of ridiculous. Like, all of us in the parkour community, we've all fallen, right? We didn't make the choice to fall. You know, it's things happen, right? You know, one of my most falls, a piece of bark broke on the branch, right? Everything was fine in my technique. Everything I did was correct, but I landed and the equipment fell. It's like I didn't choose to fall. But he actually was onto something, I think, that's really profound, which is that fear directs our attention. And it tends to either push us away from things or towards things, right? When we're paying attention to something, we kind of, our movement sort of becomes attached to that thing that we're paying attention to, right?
Your energy is projected towards whatever your attention lies on.
Yeah. So when you're doing a jump at height, right? If you have too much attention to the potential of the fall, you're going to be you're going to be reacting from it. You're going to either be overly pushing yourself one way or pulled the other way. So when I look at a jump, and I've really been paying attention to this as far as like even perceiving the visual change. So yes, 2 days ago, I was working on a jump that was probably, I don't know, maybe 15, 16 feet up in a tree. It wasn't a big jump, it was a medium-sized jump, and it was to a nice, thick tree branch. But it was challenging just because there was nothing around to grab. I really had to land precisely, and I had to trust my ability to land. And so as I was focusing on the jump, there's the perception, literally the visual perception of the fall underneath the jump. And in order to be ready to jump, that has to basically turn as blurry as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, when you're, you know, the depth of field when you're working with a camera, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can have a depth of field that allows you to see the object you're looking at and have a relatively good map of everything that's behind it. Or like the cinematic thing is usually to have the thing that you're looking at be very crisp, and then everything behind it very blurry. And that's actually what you're doing with your eyes when you're doing these jumps. You want the things that are not relevant to essentially fade into the background as much as possible. And when that happens, and when you feel the sense of tunnel vision around that thing that you're jumping to, then you're ready to jump.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not that you want to be fearless, because if you're fearless, you're careless. You don't go through the process of like really tuning everything in, but you need to get to the point where your fear does not control your attention. And then you can do the jump. Then you can do the thing.
So perception is a fascinating topic. It's a fascinating phenomenon. And interestingly, with you talking about Gibson's work in vision, or the visual field, and I'm more familiar with a guy called Donald Hoffman, who's a cognitive psychologist, I believe, and he has a model of consciousness called conscious agents. But what he describes is kind of slightly outside of the topic. What he describes, he's done a lot of work on visual intelligence and how exactly what we're describing, that it is not a recreation of what is out there, it's a literal creation of the visual system. And it's the same thing with all of the senses. He describes physical reality, which is definitively out there, because it will slap you in the face if you don't take it literally and don't pay the appropriate attention. But it's like a user interface is what he's describing. He has an example like if you're looking at your desktop and there's an icon in the bottom corner, which is a little blue folder, and that's where the emails are. And you don't look at that and think all of my emails are somehow inside that little blue icon. But it's an interface which makes all of the complexity of where the emails are and how to retrieve them something that's easy to interact with. And he describes physical reality as being that, and that ultimately, you know, consciousness is the fundamental thing, and that we have these brains which are transducing something that's far more complex outside of us into something that we can use. But that doesn't mean that you don't need to take it literally. You absolutely have to take it literally. That a snake is something which represents danger, it doesn't necessarily mean a snake actually, in whatever the other reality is, let's say, looks like a snake, but you have to take it literally that it's dangerous, and you have to take it literally that, as you're describing in the jump, that if you miss that jump, the ground is going to happen. That within a second or so, the ground's going to come and it's going to happen. The interface bit is what we're talking about. It's the perception and how you view your interaction with the environment, which I think is just a key point for life in general, right? Not just any, you know, movement training, for everything. So I guess that's kind of where we're both kind of pointing with that discussion, right? So let me just pose you another question. I won't take up too much more of your time. It's always fascinating to chat with you, so I really do appreciate your time. Let's say you were put for one day in charge of the entire world's health and wellness. You were able to, for a day, educate from your understanding and your point of view so that every single person on the planet would hear your message with regards to health, wellness, longevity, however you'd want to frame it. Take your time to answer the question, but what would be your core? What would be the core of your message? I'm always interested to hear what that would be from people who are educators and who are invested in learning continuously and have this fascination with the sort of things that we do. So what would your message be, considering that everyone would be able to hear it?
Yeah. So the difficulty there is you can get everyone to hear you, but can you get them to listen to you?
Sure.
This is a question. I'm going to go in a little bit different direction here, but this is a question that I've been playing with a lot recently, because people come to my workshops and then what they want to do is they want to go back and teach their clients, or they want to go back and create communities doing the same work. And they struggle to do that sometimes. And then they ask me, like, well, how do you teach how do you get your personal training clients to want to go play outside with you? And I was like, oh, well, I don't know, because I set up my business so that people like you would come to me, right? I try to create really pre-qualified leads in a sense. But then I recognize that those people who are asking that question to me, they're my core audience, and they need me to be proactively trying to help solve that problem. So I've been thinking a lot about the idea of how do you get people who are not super ready to try these things out, to get into them. And what I've been thinking about a lot, again, it goes back to the same thing. Perception is rooted in motivational states, is rooted in stories that we already have. And all this is also rooted into like our perceptual system. So people see my work and they see me running around in trees and they think, oh man, I would totally play in those trees if I had those trees. And they don't realize that there's a good chance that they have a tree like that that's not far away, and they've walked past it hundreds of times because their brain doesn't have a story about what's available in trees and how to move in trees, right?
You can't see it. You can't see it, yeah.
Gibson came up with this concept of affordances. You see the environment based on what the objects in that environment afford you, right? So when you see a knife, a butter knife, you know that a butter knife affords you the ability to cut butter, right? More relevant to fitness, when you see a barbell, you know that a barbell affords you the ability to do a squat, a deadlift, etc. And then you have story, you have meaning that's layered onto that. What does a squat give you? Well, a squat gives you a great ass. A squat makes you strong. A squat makes you jump high. A squat's what all the best football players are doing to be able to hit the line harder, etc. Right? All that meaning that's been built by our whole culture is embedded in your perception of the object. And the thing is that people don't have those stories around moving in trees. There's some element of the story in all of us because we're arboreal animals, and every little kid is still connected to that part of themselves in a way. But as we grow, we become more and more kind of differentiated from the instinctual side, and more kind of wrapped into the cultural side and all the stories that we have about how to behave and what different things afford us. So if you want to get people to do these kind of things that are way outside the scope of mainstream fitness, you actually have to understand the story that they're already acting out, the motivational states that they come in with. And then you need to be able to essentially give them a little bit of what's new and what's novel, and show them how it connects to the story that they already have, and how it affords them the things that they want and something a little bit extra, right? So that there's a reason for them to try on the new practice. So if you a really big important thing to understand is that novelty is threatening to people. Right? What's new always contains the potential that it destabilizes what's already working, right? And it can be catastrophic. So people's inherently have an ambivalent or negative response to what's new. So anytime you take a client who's been coming to you and you say, let's try something totally new, that's potentially a little bit threatening. It's also promising, right? Because maybe they can get even better results. But you're always playing with the fact that there's potentially a little bit of threat when you're introducing something new. So when you introduce a new idea, a new practice to somebody, you need to do it understanding that it might be threatening. It'll be more threatening to some people than to others. Do it in a way that connects to the motivational state that they already have, the story that they already have. So this connects to the question you asked, because if you wanted to change the whole world's fitness in one day, you couldn't make that big of a change because the stories are very preset, right? You'd have to think, how can I tell people a story in one day that's going to translate, and that's going to do things that they already have afforded for them in their environments, that's going to kind of move them forward. So I'm not quite sure what that would be. I'd have to think a lot about the question of what the biggest story we have out there is. But I think what I would do is that I would just try to emphasize for people that the types of movements that they enjoy doing are going to be more powerful in giving them the results that they want than the stuff that they hate doing. Like, the biggest problem that we have is that we've been taught that fitness should be approached like building parts in a factory. And this is totally non-motivational to people, and people hate it, right? So if you could make this one shift, you could get people to say, I will get fit. And fitness is just because I move myself repeatedly and do things that do things that challenge my body. I will just go find ways to challenge my body that are actually fun and engaging for me. If you could get one change, get people to be passionate about the movement things that they do. Because the biggest problem we have is that as much as we tell people that they need to run, as much as we tell people they need to do fitness stuff, they hate doing it because we're not getting into the right motivational states. So I wouldn't necessarily try to convert people to roughhousing and tree climbing in day one. I'd just be like, I would try to tell as much of the story about how motivation is key to success in long-term physical practice. And here are a bunch of tools for you to find the things that are motivational and fun for you, that engage you in physical exercise, that you can take back and engage with.
That's great, man. That just highlights just the fact that you'd be a great teacher and someone who's invested in trying to determine the best answers to things. So that's a great response, and I appreciate that. So Rafe, I'm not going to take any more of your day. I know how busy you are. You need to get ready for your course on the weekend. So yeah. From all of us at Amen Academy, thank you very much for taking time to speak to us again. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope we can do it again at some point in the future soon.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. It was a wonderful conversation. Love the questions, and look forward to chatting again soon.
Thanks, Rafe.
Thank you.